Hello, this is Development 1910, and the theme today is land allocation. We will start in a situation where there is common land with free access to everybody. And then we will introduce privatization of land, which is a development feature that you have seen in many countries, that we started out where we had free access to common land. And then it was privatized either by settlers or colonizers in other ways, or by a strong man rich enough and strong enough to sort of fence in the land and keep the land under their full control. So we're going to look for the consequences of that. You know, the normal thing that people say is that privatization is good because then we get the right incentives and efficiency improve. So here we're going to give an example of just that efficiency improve, but nevertheless it is not good for the great majority. That's the punchline today. I took it immediately, so we can see how it prevails. After that, I will discuss a little bit whether poverty is necessary or not, depending on the ownership rights and the allocation of land in the population. So these are the two themes for the lecture, and it is covered to some degrees in the handout under the same headings as I said, land reform and land allocation. Okay, then we go start, and there's, as you know, there's a diagram for everything, and we're going to now have a diagram that looks like this. It's like a bath tube, and from the left here we measure labor in on low productivity land, and from the other side we measure labor on high productivity land. So that means that the whole population we're going to consider, that's the whole line here. So that means that we have a certain population and we're not going to allocate it, and we just have two areas of land. In principle or in general, we have many different areas, maybe with different productivities of the land, more fertile land and more wasteland, that is the extremes, the commercial land that can be used for commercial farmers, for commercial farming, and you have land that is basically some sort of wasteland where you can only have low productivity crops, or maybe only grassland for animals. So, sorry. So this is the situation. We're going to illustrate the basic principle that I want you to take home, or the lessons that you can have from this. We're going to do that with only two areas. That's why we have high productivity land and low productivity land. And the high productivity land, we're going to have a blue curve for the average productivity on that land. We draw it high up here, and it is the more workers, the more people who sort of have access to this land, the lower the average productivity, remembering that the average productivity is total production on this land, the harvest on this land, divided by the number of people who sort of have been involved in producing that harvest. So it is declining. That is, since land is given, you add in more workers on this, then there is a declining average productivity. So then we have a red curve that's indicating the productivity on the low productive land. We just have a lower curve, you see, at least for some levels. For example, with so many workers on the low productivity land, it produces this, while a similar number of workers on the high productivity land will produce much more. So that's why there is a productivity difference between them. But also here, it is a declining productivity dependent on how many workers that have access to the land, sort of compete for in the sharing. When we are thinking about that, they are sharing the harvest equally, in the sense that that everybody get the average productivity. So what would be, if you have sort of free migration, think about this in a long historical context, what would be the free migration of workers here across areas? Well, if we were in a situation where where it was higher productivity on the high, they earn more on the high productivity land, and people would sort of move into the high productivity land, and that means that you would go down on this curve. This would be the case until you are in the point here that we call A. So that means if you this means that if we were here, for example, that means that workers on high productivity land earn this much, and workers on low productivity land earn this much. But there's free access to the high productivity land, and people will of course move from the low productivity land to the higher productivity land, and this will happen just until you have an allocation of workers across these areas, that we geographical areas, we can think about them as, where this amount of the total workforce up to this dotted area, dotted number of workers here, are on low productivity land, and this number here, all those here, are on the high productivity land. But we see that each worker would earn the same, whether they are on high productivity land or low productivity land, because if they didn't earn the same, then you would allocate then you would migrate or leave to the better pay or the better income that you can obtain elsewhere. So this is just the simplest migration theory that you can think of, that workers self-allocate themselves such that there's no gain by migrating to some other places. They have more or less the same income, and in the diagram, equal income across areas. And this will hold no matter there are two or many areas. But let us also draw some other curves here. One that indicates the marginal productivity on high productivity land. That will be a curve that is below this solid blue curve. Why is it below? Because that's the marginal contribution of adding another worker into that area. That's the reason this must be below the average, because that's the reason why the average is falling. That every new worker produces less than the average of those who are there already. So that means that the average productivity goes down simply because the marginal productivity is below the average. And that is always the case, as we have sort of repeatedly said in this lecture, that when you have decreasing returns to scale, then you always have the marginal productivity being lower than the average productivity. We have done this with many illustrations, and in the handout notes that you have, then this was discussed in the beginning of the handout in these notes. And similar for the low productivity land, that's going to be a marginal productivity below the average productivity in this case. So these are just definitional things. Once you have the average productivity, sort of have observed that, say, for different levels of workers, then you would know what the marginal contribution is, because that is just what you add in total production by adding yet another worker. And since the average goes down, then the margin must be low, must be below the average. So this is the case. I know we think that we are starting in a point A. That is the historical starting point. People in, say, this is an African country, or maybe more than one country, they have moved around until sort of the average productivity is the same across areas. Otherwise, they will change location, and we think of this as a free access to the land. So we are here in A in the beginning. So think now that the high productivity land, that is privatized. There's earnings on this high productivity land, and there is some settlers. Say this is the southern part of Africa. Settlers came into the country. Cecil Rhodes, for example, came with his population into what is now Zimbabwe. He named the country after himself, Rhodesia. That's after Cecil Rhodes. So he came in and took the best land, and he fenced off those people who used to live there, and privatized it. But of course, he needed workers to work on the land. He didn't work the land himself, so he needed workers to work the land, or he and his followers, they needed workers to work on the land, and so they hired workers to do that job. Well, what would be if all this blue area land, this high productivity land, was sort of captured by Cecil Rhodes? What will he do? Well, what he will do then is, of course, he will try to hire workers for the lowest pay that he can get them for. What is the lowest pay that he can get workers for? Well, he has to compensate what they can get by moving into the free access red area. Then at least they have to have a wage by working for Cecil Rhodes that is higher than this average. So what would he do to maximize profits? Well, as long as the marginal contribution of adding a new worker to his land area is higher than the average productivity in the alternative for the worker, it will benefit Cecil Rhodes to hire them on his farm or his set of farms. So he will end up there, profit maximizing behavior by these settlers. They will end up here. Let's call that C. It will correspond to the notation in the handout, so therefore I call it C. So you can see the same in the fixed drawn figure in the handout. Why is this profitable for him? Well, because the margin contribution all the way up here, he hires, is above the average productivity, which will be the sort of the best outside option for the workers. So at least you have to compensate by them. But when it comes here, he won't then a marginal an additional worker on these commercial farms run by Cecil Rhodes and his group of settlers. They won't expand production more on their private farms, because then the margin contribution will be below the average income that these guys, these workers have access to. So in that case, this will be the wage, and then he wouldn't like to hire them, because the margin contribution is down there, and the pay he has to pay by expanding up there is higher. So he would end up there. This would be the profit maximizing allocation of workers if you only privatize the blue area. So what will be then his profits? Well, that will be the amount of workers that he has, the average productivity that each of them has, and the wage that he pays them, that is this. And the average productivity, let's just to have a number, call it X. The average productivity, and if I multiply this by the difference here, that is the height here between these two parallel curves, the difference here, that of course is his profit. So, so the profit in that case is this hatched area that I marked with some green dots here. That is the profit that goes to him. And you see that compared to point A here, the first privatization one has led to that you have less workers on the most productive land, and the workers have lost the wage or the income. They didn't have a wage when they moved freely with free access, but the income they had per person, that was higher there, and you moved on here. But say now that you also privatize the red area. That's also privatized. Well, what would then happen? Well, if you privatize the red area, then of course no, the labor market, no, they have to pay. The wage was up here, but no, when you privatize the red land as well, then the new owners of the red land, they fence off the workers and they try to hire them as wage earners back again. And given that wage here, they will only hire so many if this is the wage. But no, there will be idle people, and they will compete the wage down until you are here. The new equilibrium case is this point B here. So what that means that you will extend the profits even more on the average on the blue commercial farms, because this privatization of the red area drives down the wages, because workers no longer have access to this red common that used to be commonly owned land. So privatization drives down the wages first to point C here and now to point B here. So that means that for the red, in this allocation here, the new wage is now what I marked with red here. So let's call this is the low. I call it just with the L for indicating that's the wage in the low area, and the average productivity in the low area. Sorry, I think that I drew a little mistake. So excuse me, my friends. The average productivity in this B area, that's the number of workers that marked now with a star. The number of workers in the red valley, so to speak. The red valley has so many workers from 0 up to the star, and the profits that they have is going to be the difference between the average productivity in the red valley and the wage in the red valley times the number of workers. So this is going to be the green, let me put green dots on the profits again. This is going to be the profits in the green valley. But what will now happen in the blue valley, of course, then the wages will go down, because no workers don't have the same options as they used to have. So they will also end up with the same wage as in the red valley. So that means that they will get exactly the same wage, both in the high area in the blue valley and in the red valley. So that means that you extend the profits here now to be also to include this rectangle, because they know how to get excess profits from the wage reduction that you have. And that extends all the way up to here, because this is the new allocation. Of course, the average productivity now is in the blue valley is lower. So this is all in all the profits in the blue valley. But since we obtained the new rectangular that is hatched in this way, you obtain that by allocating workers that had a wage that was lower or equal to the marginal productivity of these workers. Then it's always the case that this with the stripes must be bigger than this previous profits that we have, because the additional allocation of workers, we add workers at the costs that are lower to their marginal productivity, and that we just add to Cecil Rhodes Group's profits. So this is the situation. What is the there's a loss for all workers in this case. We move from point A to point B. They used to have a wage equal to A, now or income equal to A, and now they get an income equal to B. So all workers loses from the privatization. The only gainers here are those who acquire the property rights. So if those who require property rights were all the workers, if the land were given to all the workers, this would be fine. Then they would just obtain an efficiency gain from this movement. But since it is a separate group of owners that just owns the land, say they are the minority. For the case of Cecil Rhodes in Rhodesia, they were a very small group compared to the big African population in the area. So they were the winners, and they gained a lot. And the workers were the big time losers. Let me just erase something on the figure. You can draw a new one, or you have it in the handout. I'm just going to illustrate something. I'm going to more or less draw it again, but it's going to be exactly the same figure. We're going to just point out one more thing before I talk a little bit more general about this. So we had two areas, the Red Valley and this was the average productivity, and this was the marginal productivity in the Red Valley. In the Blue Valley, we had the same declining. Now we measured the number of workers in the Blue Valley from this side. So that means that we had these two curves. So we compared, this was point A, and this was point B, and this was point, I'll take that back, this was point C, I call it, and this was point B. What is the efficient point here? Well, no big surprise. It is it was meant to be this. This is what we call the star allocation of workers, where so many workers are in the Red Valley and so many workers are in the Blue Valley. Why is this efficient? Why isn't efficient? Why is it an improvement in efficiency compared to the point A here? Well, to go from point A to point B here, what do we do? Well, we take workers with with a marginal productivity equal to this level here, and compare it to the marginal productivity, say we are in this point A here. So the marginal productivity on the blue area is this low. The marginal productivity on the red area is much higher. So we move to the right to get to point star here, where the allocation is equal to B. And for every movement, we take workers from here and put them into a higher productivity. Take workers from here and put them into a higher marginal contribution, and so on. So that means that this area here, this is the efficiency gain. So this is an efficiency gain, but this is not the only thing that's happened. This efficiency gain is a small amount compared to the loss of all the workers. What is the loss of all the workers? Well, the workers used to get all this, everything that is in here. That was what the African workers obtained if they, by assumption here, used the land for the same good purposes as before. So this was the total income that they have. Average income being the same in the blue and the red valley, multiplied by the numbers of workers in the whole area. So that was the total income. What is the income after privatization? Well, that is this area. Let's mark that with a green. So this is the income of the workers afterwards. We compare the whole area here to this hatched area, the green area, and this difference between these two blocks, that is the total loss of loss in income from privatization. So while all in all, society as a whole, the settlers together with the workers gain is in total is this, but the huge all this gain plus much more goes to the settlers. So what is the settlers getting? Well, they are getting the wage is equal to this black line. We know that this is the wage where the marginal curves intersect. That's the new wage or labor income, and we know that with this allocation of workers, well, then in the blue valley they earn this much in profits. Why is that? The average productivity in the blue area minus the wage they have to pay, multiplied by the number of workers that they have the whole year. That means the difference is this, and the number of workers is this. So the whole rectangular there is the profits to the settlers in the blue valley. To the settlers in the red valley, the profits are not so high because the average productivity is lower. So that in their case, the difference is this is the average productivity in the blue valley, in the red valley, sorry, and this is the wage. So this is the difference. So in their case, this is the profits to the settlers in the red valley. So the workers lose, both the settler groups gain, but not equally much. And the logic here is that you obtain, it's like similar to sort of free trade, that you obtain a rather minor gain for society as a whole, but the allocation between groups, when you have very unequal ownership to the land, is tremendous. A big loss to the workers, moving down from all this to this area here marked with the green, and those who extract profits from this are the settlers in the blue valley and the settlers in the red valley. The settlers in the red valley get this, the settlers in the blue valley get this. So the logic here is based on that there is no productivity, there's no productivity gain in the link between how many workers you have and what is the harvest, what is the output from the land. That is not what's driving the result here. What's driving the result is that you have with the same link between how much workers there are in a certain area and what you can produce in this area. That's the same independent of ownership. The difference is that you use cost savings in the use of labor, and then you reallocate workers in a different manner. And this reallocation, by use only after the marginal contribution of the workers compared to the best alternative they have. If you always expand when the marginal productivity is higher than the wage, then you are bound to end up in a situation where the wages are equal to this level that you have in point B here, and that give rise to the rents or the profits for commercial farming in the red valley like this, in the blue valley like this. So that is a lesson to learn, not because it's always like this, but it is always that this under the premise of what I did. The premise is that these production relationships are the same. You can't think about that there are some private farmers that come in and they have, maybe they have more fertilizers, they have more of other things that increase the productivity. Then the picture is not so black and white as I told you here, but it's underlying all this, there is this distributional conflict between privatization that creates in the diagram here, this efficiency gains in this, just in this black hatched area, but with tremendous gains to the settlers and losses. The big area here is the loss compared to what the workers end up getting. So this is the story I would like you to take on board, that privatization of common land should be compensated. If this was actually common land in the sense that this was nature contribution to the livelihood of people living in this particular area in Africa, just grabbing the land as the settlers did, reduce the income for the people who used to live there without any compensation. Maybe they added something. They started to grow tobacco that they didn't do that before. They started with other things, but in all, they didn't compensate at all for the big black majority in the area. And you can go on like this to consider areas in Latin America where you have that it wasn't settlers that came to Latin America, but it was more people who only out of extracting resources from the countries that they came to. But this is going beyond the sort of lessons here. Learning these tricks that I sort of showed you here, you learn a lesson about average and marginal productivity and equilibrium, the new equilibrium being here, the old one being here. You have total privatization here, and here you have no privatization at all, but access to common land and people can move freely. You have such an intermediate equilibrium situation here, where you have partial privatization only on the blue valley, and full privatization is in point. I have one more thing that I would like to say here, but this is unrelated to this. Now let me motivate it a little bit in this term. Here we moved from a labor income in point A to a labor income in point B that is much lower. But we didn't have any concern whether this labor income here was enough to survive on. So maybe you need some sort of pay that is above the level of pay that you get in B, because this is just a market clearing wage, and there's nothing in the concept of market clearing that guarantee that this wage is high enough that you can sustain and reproduce the labor of your household, that you can feed the family and so on. So we have discussed some of that earlier, and I don't want to go through that necessarily here, but I will just use remind you about one simple thing about this. So how should you say, the minimum wage set by God, in the sense that you can't survive on a wage lower than that. So let me just draw a new figure, and it's going to be of the same type here. So to keep the connection, think about that it is you measure, this is the high productivity land, and you're only going to look for one high productivity land. So you're only going to say that it looks like this. So this is if all the workers are on the high productivity land. You should know for the example, say that this is there's only a blue valley. There's only one valley in the country, and this is the blue valley. So and let them say that just by construction, we sort of say that the wage, when the necessary wage is W star. That means that this is the wage that you need in order to survive in this area. If you get a lower wage than that, then you can't survive in the long run. So this is subsistence wage, sometimes it's called. So I just draw the figures, and when you use when the total population, that is the whole area from here to here, are employed on a high productivity land, and there are no other land than this high productivity land, then there is enough. Production, and I just pick a valley a country that's just satisfy this, just enough production that everybody can survive. So everything is almost fine. If these guys are left to themselves, they earn a subsistent income. Everybody is employed. Maybe they even are happy. I don't know, but we hope for the best. And what will happen now if you have privatization of this land? Well, if you privatize that land, the relevant thing for Cicero Roads guys, that is this curve here. So, and they know that they can't pay a lower wage than W star. So what will maximize Cicero Roads' profit here, of course, is to employ this number of workers. You employ this number of workers. So these guys here, they are, I would call them destituted. Maybe you can't read this. Let me move that up a little bit. This number of people here, they are, I would call it destituted. They are poor, And what they live off, God knows. Maybe they just fish a little bit and they get some berries in the forest and so on, but they are really destitute. They are poor. They're excluded. But this is what maximizes. This is what maximizes profit. And again, the profit you see the roads is this blue hatched area here. It is the average productivity in the profit maximizing amount of workers to the subsistent wage W star multiplied by the number of workers he has, and that his profit is going to be that, the profit on the land. So, so what is the morale here? Well, even in cases where you have enough productivity to feed everybody, there is enough land to feed everybody. There is a large chunk of people in the market equilibrium with private ownership of land that ends up destituted and undernourished because they earn less than W star. Defining W star by this nutritional requirement that is necessary to survive in the area. So in this case, it is an illustration that poverty in many countries can be completely unnecessary. It can be completely unnecessary in the sense that if you took the total land, the whole Blue Valley, and divided it up on family farms and gave that land to the workers who live there, then each of them would run their farm and earning at least the income W star, in spite of the fact that with the private ownership allocation with one big owner and many workers being hired would lead to a high amount of malnutrition because you have this share of destituted workers with too low earnings. So that is something to think about, that how this is an example how land reform would sort of solve the poverty problem. And maybe it is a way too optimistic picture of a land reform, but nevertheless a land reform. It can also, an allocation of this type could be that you give subsidies, you take all the surplus from the land, you tax the land rent, so to speak. You tax the land rent of the settlers, and you give it out in the form of support to the workers. Well, then everybody can end up here. You just run it as commercial farms, but you tax the surplus and give it to all the workers with equal share to each. Then you will end up with all the workers earning W star, everybody being employed, because you just subsidize the workers, so that the hiring wage of the workers becomes lower and lower and lower because they get part of the income from this, how should you say, basic wage that accrue to them by taxing the surplus of the land. And these types of reform, as described in the handout, that has been highly debated all since the French Revolution. In the 1790s, there was many proposals of how you can have a land tax or a land rent tax, as it normally is called. So a little digression before I end. If you hear people saying the land rent, and this is only makes sense to those of you who can speak Norwegian. In Norwegian, this is sometimes translated to grunnrente or landrente, but that is a misunderstanding, because rente in Norwegian means interest rate, and rent here means the price to rent the land. There's a rental price, so that this means that these settlers that came in, they just stole the land. They should have paid the rental price for the land. What is the rental price for the land? This is the rental price of the land, namely the contribution of land itself beyond the marginal productivity of the workers. And that land renters, these social reformers in 1790s, they argued that that should be shared to everybody. Thomas Paine, for example, had a suggestion about sharing the land rent, and many others had it. Henry George later on, he thought that the whole society should be financed by a tax on land, taxing this kind of surplus here, and should be shared to everybody. If you give it as subsidized to subsidized workers or compensating part of them, they can obtain W star in the end and be able to work in agriculture and there could be an expansion of employment, so you remove the number of destituted and everybody become, just as you have a common access, so divide up the land to everybody. So these are two competing ways of sort of equal sharing in the simplest setup of an agriculture problem. Or it can be a fishing water, or it can be fishing rights in the ocean, it can be different things. If you privatize fishing rights, well, then you have restrict the quota to less fishing than before. You create a surplus, but to what is the right of those who happens to just to get the quota to keep the surplus for themselves? Maybe none. That was the argument of the social reformers in 1790. And they argued for a sort of basic income to everybody based on a tax like that. There's a little bit more discussion on this in the handout, not much, but a little more. The basic lesson here is to see that privatization can create malnutrition, destitution, even in situations where there is enough land that could feed everybody at the proper level. Okay, thanks for now.